Hello and welcome to SPUI 25 Online. My name is René Koekkoek. I'm an assistant professor in the Political History Division at Utrecht University. Tonight I will be moderating this live stream event dedicated to White Freedom, the Racial History of an Idea, the new book by historian Tyler Stovall. So welcome, Professor Stovall, first of all, from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It is an honor and a great pleasure to have you with us tonight. And it's also a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Francio Guadeloupe, who will join us in tonight's conversation. And finally, of course, a warm welcome to you all, the online audience. So let me first announce tonight's program. I will start by introducing tonight's speakers, and then Dr. Guadeloupe will kick off with an opening statement. I will subsequently interview Professor Stovall about his book. And in the last 15 minutes, there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions and continue the conversation with both Professor Stovall and Dr. Guadeloupe. But before I introduce our speakers, let me mention that SPUI 25 is actually a real and concrete place which deserves emphasis in these digital times. It is one of the great cultural academic platforms of Amsterdam, wonderfully located at the SPUI, an historic square in the city center. And usually these kinds of evenings, an evening like this, would end in a typical brown cafe and perhaps a stroll along the canals of the city. So Professor Stovall, please do visit us in Amsterdam after this whole pandemic crisis is over, because we still owe you that. So let me first introduce to you our speakers. Tyler Stovall is a renowned historian of 20th century France and the wider Atlantic and Caribbean. He has written and edited more than 10 books, numerous articles and chapters on a wide variety of topics, on the Paris suburbs, on African Americans in Paris, the French working class, the history of migration from the French Caribbean to the metropole, and many other topics in the history of colonial and post-colonial France. Professor Stovall received his PhD in 1984 on the working class suburbs of Paris from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then he taught for almost 3 decades at the University of California, first at Santa Cruz and then at Berkeley. From 2016 to 2017, Professor Stovall was the president of the American Historical Society. And last year, he moved from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast to take up a position as the new dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Fordham University in New York City. And in January this year, his newest book was published, White Freedom, by Princeton University Press. Our other guest is Dr. Francio Guadeloupe. He is a cultural and social anthropologist at the University of Amsterdam. He is a senior research fellow at the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies in Leiden. In Dutch, it's known as the KITLV, het Koninklijk Instituut voor Taal, Land en Volkenkunde. Dr. Guadeloupe has written a great many articles and books, including the book with the delicious title, Chanting Down the New Jerusalem, Calypso, Christianity and Capitalism in the Caribbean, which was published in 2009 with the University of California Press. And this year, he has not one, but 2 books coming out. One in Dutch, Rotterdam, een postkoloniale stad in beweging, Rotterdam, a postcolonial city on the move. And another book in English with the title, So How Does It Feel to Be a Black Man in the Netherlands, an Anthropological Account. So we see already here a wonderful overlap of the interests, between the interests of both Dr. Guadeloupe and Professor Stovall. So Francio Guadeloupe, welcome, and I would like to invite you to give your opening statement. So please, the screen is yours.
Brilliant. Good evening to the audience that's tuning in. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for having me here. One correction, the book Rotterdam een postkoloniale stad in beweging came out last year. The other one to come out this year. Anyway, that's okay. Yeah. So let me give a short response to Professor Stovall's White Freedom. Now, I begin by highly recommending the excellent book, White Freedom. So I would say to people, please go out and purchase a copy after this webinar, or order a copy at Atheneum Bookstore in Amsterdam. Professor Stovall begins the book with a quote that in many ways remained haunting me. And I would say perhaps it was a specter motivating him to write the book. Here's the quote that many of you will be familiar with. It's a quote. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End of quote. This sentence, as you know, or these sentences are taken from the American Declaration of Independence. Now, no one who has read this book or who's going to read it can deny that Professor Stovall stands critically in that long and venerable tradition of African-American sages. W.E.B. Du Bois comes to mind, as does Henry Louis Gates Jr., who have sought to transpose the American Declaration of Human Rights, or American Declaration of Independence, and other such lofty documents like the French Declarations of the Rights of Men and Citizens into living testimonies of a reality where racism is no more. But in doing so, Professor Stovall reminds us, and I quote again, "One cannot simply extend the narrative of freedom to those who were not free without making a mockery of their own history." End of quote. This atelic body of work, teleology, is perpetually deconstructed in this tradition, so we're not moving to something. The world is incessantly reminded that, I quote again, "If liberty represents the acme of Western civilization, racism, embodied above all by the histories, the horrible histories, like the slave trade and the Holocaust, is its nadir." End of quote. So for Professor Stovall, in the tradition that I think he's in, we have to get rid of racism. And what Stovall adds is racism and its outgrowth, white freedom, which is wolfish freedom, for us to come to a freedom that recognizes all. White freedom, Professor Stovall explains, is the belief, and I quote him again, from the book, "It is the belief and the practice that freedom is central to white racial identity, and that only white people can or should be free." End of quote. It reminds me of a similar argument found in W.E.B. Du Bois' essay, "The Souls of White Folk." Is this a coincidence, I ask? So my first question to Professor Stovall is, does he place this study in the tradition of critical African-American scholarship on the transnational racial dynamics that emerged in the modern world? Now, I recognize that there's no one scholarly African-American tradition dealing with the topic, but there are multiple traditions of scholarship. And many of those traditions are part of a critical secular history. So I trust that when he answers the question, he will take all of this on board. Now, in everything that I've said above, mark that I did not say that this constellation of traditions that I heuristically place Professor Stovall in, and I cannot know until he answers, I did not say that race should be no more. I said racism should be no more. Whiteness is a different matter. As Du Bois, before him, Professor Stovall totally rejects whiteness. But race to court, I am unsure. I do not know after reading the book if Professor Stovall is inviting his readers to relinquish racial belonging thoroughly and thus deconstruct race totally in undoing white freedom. I'm unsure because of passages like these. I quote again. "Racially subordinate groups have also embraced the ideal of racial pride, usually as a response to and rejection of racial oppression. The processes by which peoples who are lumped together according to stereotypes and discrimination develop a positive sense of group identity are extremely complex. Like nations, racial minorities must be constructed over time. Scholars have studied how slaves from a variety of places in Africa gradually became Black Americans in the United States, or how modern Zionism crafted a new nation from diverse Jewish populations. The point is that such processes involved creating a positive sense of racial identity, often modeled on that of the nation. The term Black nationalism is no accident. From the idea of the race man as someone dedicated to Black community empowerment to the Black is Beautiful movement in the 1960s, racial pride has constituted not only a key African-American ideology, but also a powerful weapon against racism. End of quote. Now, I am not sure if this and other passages like this found throughout the book are descriptive, normative, or prescriptive statements. Perhaps they are a mix. I hope Professor Stovall can speak to this. As you gathered from the passage I just read, Professor Stovall is apt at making the concept of race dance in the sense of historicizing and contextualizing it. But there is something in this discussion of race that remains in the sense of it returns. Perhaps what returns is not the trans-historical idea of race, for a genealogical approach could show that it is only the word race that remains stable, while its meaning shifts with times and context. And Professor Stovall does an excellent job in doing this with whiteness. Perhaps what returns is Professor Stovall's personal history and politics in relation to two easy deconstructions of race by non-racialists. Perhaps he considers the total deconstruction of race too premature, in the sense of, for instance, the current view of the French state that will have nothing to do with statistics looking at racial minorities. So, question, could Professor Stovall explicate the politics animating his scholarship in this book and in a wider sense? Now, all of this is but intuitions. I would have had to read this book a couple of times, truly study it to begin to explain why I'm posing the questions that I am. And I may be totally wrong, but when Professor Stovall writes, quote, there are many political variants of human liberty, I for one wonder if all of the ethno-racially coded ones need not be critically scrutinized, even if in the past and the present, some help subalternized populations cope with white rage. To the end. New and old-fangled terms such as multiraciality, biraciality, a racial settlement, good racial relations or good race relations, racial pride, Black nationalism, Zionism, etc., are, in my estimation, not about a total renunciation of race. They are, it seems to me, attempts to expand the American Declaration, that to expand and have more people be part of it. That declaration and those words of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And some reading Professor Stovall's book may say, yes, but let us get the history right. Let us appreciate the history of white freedom before or as we engage in this expansive work of broadening these liberal doctrines. So this is about the renunciation of whiteness. I'm unsure if it's about renunciation of race in all its expressions. A total renunciation of race, on the other hand, eschews the new and old-fangled terms and would mean that white and Black and brown identity, African-American identity, and say Arab or Jewish American identity would be no more. They would make no sense in terms of race, that is. This is what I mean with them being no more. So don't get me wrong, there's a kind of realism that I recognize. They will be no more in the sense that they will not be grounded in racial logics. Isn't this Professor Stovall's ultimate point? I think it is sometimes when Professor Stovall seems to imply that the racialization of the identities of subalternized populations is to a larger extent or importantly dependent on whiteness and white freedom. He writes, nearing the ending of the book, Today, the push for today the push for white freedom is in many ways a response to the inability of modern societies to provide those achievements, and he means life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, listed above, that freedom was supposed to ensure. And as long as this remains the case, racialized visions of liberty will retain their ability to inspire and motivate those searching for a better life. Perhaps Professor Stovall wishes us to venture and conceive of a world of identities and differences without any recourse to race. To leave, in other words, the cage of race where we continuously misrecognize each other and move into a space where the language and discourse of race and the history of the struggles of the people we descend from need not be directly us. But you may ask, without race or our people's history, who would we be? Perhaps we would be multiple. We would renounce the subjectivity of group wholeness, able to positively accommodate responsible liberalism. And I mean, Professor Stovall gives a critical interrogation of liberalism, liberal democracy, and its relation to white freedom. So we could move from that kind of subjectivity of the individual and the group to a subjectivity of inconsistent multiplicity, able to connect because the boundaries of the self and of a group are bridges as well as doors. So they're not only doors, the self is not a door closed off, but the self is a bridge that connects to others. The latter conception of subjectivity is not discussed in any sustained fashion in Professor Stovall's book. That other subjectivity reminds us of the subaltern tradition found in Afro-Atlantic religiosities, which are quintessential Creole products, bridging different ways of knowing. As much African, Asian, and European, Candomblé, Umbanda, Santeria, Montamento, Shango are examples of these. The subjectivity promoted in Afro-Atlantic religiosities is such that every person, regardless of how he or she looks, of their racial or family background, is inhabited by the peoples of the world, because everyone is a product of 500 years of global transactions. This subaltern tradition cannot be easily subsumed under the American Declaration, its French counterpart, or other such liberal doctrines, because the creator is put under erasure. And that creator is oftentimes a kind of oneness that only tolerates a certain kind of difference, whilst these traditions are talking about an inconsistent multiplicity and not per se of a oneness. So which means that they're doing something else. The nation is gone, but the state remains, and on the state, other subjectivities can be built. My last point. Professor Stovall does speak favorably about religions. He does not necessarily delve into the Afro-Atlantic religiosities. He mentions religion, and we know that African Americans chose Christianity to commune in their early days, only later connecting this practice of communing to race, when a middle-class intelligentsia emerged seeking to resignify race positively. So my question, and this is the last question, is there a germ of the subaltern tradition I spoke about, that of the African American or the Afro-American religiosities, that will have nothing of a oneness, but will have everything of a multiplicity that is continuously changing and that can connect? So not speaking about doors, but speaking about bridges, subjectivity as a bridge towards the other. Is there a germ of that in African American Christian communities? And I would like Professor Stovall to speak about these, because these might lead us to a situation in which race cannot return, even after we deconstruct white freedom. So lastly, can I have freedom without race? Not only whiteness and white freedom, but without race to court? If not, Professor Stovall, could you explain? Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guadeloupe, for this rich opening statement, and also a series of challenging questions to Professor Stovall. So Professor Stovall, I'd like to assure you that you will have an opportunity to respond to Dr. Guadeloupe's statement. But I first want to ask you some more basic questions about the book, and then once we delve further into the book, you have every opportunity to respond to Dr. Guadeloupe's challenging questions. So I want to first, before I want to ask you about the main thesis of your book, I'd like to address the near and almost uncanny coincidence of the publication of your book, which I believe was on January 19, and the event 2 weeks earlier. And I'm of course referring to January 6, the storming of the United States Capitol building by a violent mob of supporters of Donald Trump. So your book came out amidst the aftermath and fallout of that historic event. So what kind of connection do you see between the history you are describing in your book and the storming of the Capitol? Or, in other words, how do you interpret the storming of the Capitol from the perspective of your book?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing me here, and thank you, Dr. Guadeloupe, for that really wonderful series of questions. Yes, the coincidence of January 6th, my initial reaction was Princeton University Press has a marketing division like I've never heard of in my life, that they were able to organize something like this. But no, seriously, it was shocking. I mean, first of all, to be in America, to see something like that happen in a way that nothing like that had ever happened before, in at least our modern history, was just unbelievable. Watching that as an American, so like most Americans, I think probably like most people in the world, I was just profoundly shocked by it. But I also, and thinking about it, I remember watching the news coverage of that event over and over, and being struck by the fact that, first of all, here was an almost entirely white crowd that was allowed to invade one of the most sacred spaces of American democracy, allowed to invade it, allowed to mess it up, allowed to, sort of simply ignore any principles, allowed to attack the police that were guarding it, and allowed to simply depart without any real consequences, at least initially. And so my first reaction was, well, if this doesn't show that freedom isn't white in America, I don't know what does, right? Because there was, and all you had to do is contrast that with the police reaction against Black Lives Matter demonstrations earlier in the year, which were much more violent, much more stringent. And the difference was real, even though the Black Lives Matter demonstrations are much more peaceful and much more orderly, they were greeted with a much more radical police presence because they were Black, basically. So it seemed to be not just January 6th, but the combination of those two types of events really underscored in graphic terms the racial nature of freedom in America today.
So let's now turn to the central theme of the book. It's the relationship between freedom and race. And for a long time, as you argue in the introduction, many scholars have argued that racism contradicts freedom. And you present a completely different picture. So can you explain how you view the historical relationship between race and freedom?
Certainly, it's sort of a truism of the history of the modern Western world that there's a basic contradiction between countries that really embrace the idea of freedom, and I focus especially on the United States and France, but not just those two, and the contradiction of how they could embrace this idea and yet be engaged in many practices that were not at all protective of freedom, especially when it came to racism. And ultimately, I became uncomfortable with the idea that you could have people living this kind of contradiction for years and years and centuries. It seems to me if people held these ideas together, there must be something that brought them together, that linked them internally. And so in exploring that, I decided it was the idea that freedom had to be defined in certain terms, in certain racial terms. In other words, freedom was not freedom for everybody, but it was freedom for people that were defined as white. That part of being free meant to be white, and part of being white meant to be free. And so that was the thesis that I adopted, and it seemed to me made sense of what was usually portrayed as a really dichotomy between two opposed concepts. And yet I was looking at the ways in which they were not opposed at all, but rather worked together. And
maybe could you clarify what the scope of your argument is. So clearly, you're not arguing that all articulations of freedom in modern history have been examples of white freedom.
Right.
I was just wondering, could you say a little bit more about sort of the principal cast of characters of your book?
Sure.
Who are the sort of the central agents of your story?
Okay, well, let me do it both chronologically and geographically, if you will. Chronologically, the book really starts with the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolutions at the end of the 18th century, the age of the American Revolution, the French Revolutions, the revolutions in Saint-Domingue, and looks at the way in which the whole idea of race was developed at a time when there was also a tremendous amount of emphasis, both intellectually and ultimately politically, on the idea of freedom and freedom struggles. Historians of 18th century France have pointed out, historians of the Enlightenment have pointed out that at the basis of French society, at the basis of the French economy in that century was the slave trade and was slavery in Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue was the most profitable slave colony and probably in world history. And a good part of the French economy in the 18th century was tied up with the profits from the slave trade, with the profits from that colony in particular. So when Enlightenment philosophers looked at these kinds of issues, they were also looking at something that was very much a part of their own society, whether or not they chose to recognize it. And the same is true in what became the United States after 1776. And so I take the story from there and then take it up to the present day, in fact, up to the very much the present day, looking at the ways in which struggles for freedom, ideas of freedom, were also combined with racialism and racist behavior. So one of the ideas that got me started thinking about this issue was when I was looking at the history of British and French imperialism in the 19th and early 20th century. And it struck me as really interesting that you had two countries, Britain and France, that both had the largest empires in the world, colonial empires in the world, that were also seen as the most democratic and progressive states in Europe, right? And this sort of went counter to what people argued in terms of the rise of democracy, the rise of liberal democracy in particular. And I wanted to explore that more. And then I look at the era of the world wars as both an era of continued white freedom, but also an era of the struggle against white freedom, because that's the other point I wanted to make in response to your question, is that there's always been a struggle for freedom as a universal concept, as something that belonged to all men and women. And this was something that really took shape, especially, I mean, it always existed, but it especially took shape in the early 20th century, in the era of the world wars, and then leading to decolonization and the civil rights movement. So you had that. And so that's the sort of chronology of it. In terms of geography, I chose to write a book that focused primarily on the United States and France for, basic instrumental reasons. I'm trained as a historian of France. I'm an American born and bred. In fact, one of the ironies of my life is I was actually born in a town in Ohio that was founded by emigres from the French Revolution. It's named Gallipolis, and the name is no accident. So I guess I was born to be a French historian. But, it's not just that these are two countries I knew well, but also these were two countries for whom the idea of freedom was absolutely central to their national identity. Probably more than just about any other countries in the world. To be French, to be American, meant to be a free citizen of those countries, and the emphasis was on free. Now, having done that, I decided I could not, France and the United States were absolutely central, but they were not the entire story. One also had to look at other imperial regimes, especially that of Britain. One also had to look at fascism and Nazi Germany in particular, and how its own ideas of race dovetailed or combined or were articulated with ideas of freedom for the German people under the Nazi regime. So those are sort of the context of it. And then I really end up, the last chapter is entitled The Fall and Rise of White Freedom. I look at the challenges that in many ways were successful, posed by the movements for decolonization, the movements for civil rights, against white freedom. But then I look at the ways in which white freedom has a rebound at the end of the 20th century, the beginnings of the 21st century. And is still, this is still very much an issue to this day.
This was really an incredible summary of a book of 500 pages. So I want to ask you, as you also point out in your book, racial thinking, racial theories themselves have a history, have histories, you might say. And my question requires a little bit of introduction. So at some point, you also acknowledge that Enlightenment theories of racial classification were more mutable, less deterministic than these more hardened 19th century biological, quasi-scientific
Mhm.
racist theories. The racist theories that can be associated with Arthur de Gobineau, the French racist scientist. But an equally important, if not also dominant way of explaining and legitimizing inequality between peoples was framed in terms of civilization. So the idea that inequality is explained in terms of the stage of historical progress peoples were thought to have reached. And so this really typical Enlightenment thinking of way of thinking about the progress of history. So the idea would be only civilized people, only enlightened people have a right, have a capacity to be free. Now, for many Frenchmen and Americans who didn't really want to subscribe to virulent racism, this theory of inequality in terms of civilization was actually quite attractive because they could argue on the one hand, well, so we do accept a certain natural equality between people. We do accept the idea that people have natural rights, but still we can deny them freedom because we deem them insufficiently civilized.
Mhm.
So this introduces a more of a structure of temporality. So the idea that in an undetermined future we might extend freedom to others. So my question is: so to what extent and how does your concept of white freedom and of racialized freedom relate to these ideas of civilization and of hierarchy in terms of civilization?
Okay, yes, thank you for that question. And it's a question that has a number of different parts to it. So let me just try and at least tackle a couple. One of the things I'm interested in is the whole issue of colonialism as a kind of civilizing mission. I mean, that's what it was called in France, for example. And there were other aspects of it, similar ideas in Britain and America and other countries. But let me focus on France for the moment. The idea was that you were invading these countries to civilize them. I mean, much of the French Empire in Africa, for example, began with attempts to stamp out the slave trade. And the idea was you had to not just establish forts on the coast, but go upriver to stamp out slavery at its source. And that was really the basis of the creation of French colonies in much of Africa. So the French had this idea that, yes, if you could demonstrate that you were civilized, which basically meant that you were civilized French style, then yes, it was acceptable for you to become a French citizen. Now, one of the missing pieces of that equation is that, of course, in order for people to become, quote, civilized, they have to be educated. If you're going to pass tests in French, you have to be trained to read French, for example. French investment in colonial education was virtually non-existent. If you're talking about creating a people that is civilized and educated, you have to invest in education, and the French did not. So it was hardly surprising that people were, for the most part, not able to meet the standards that were held up. And this, of course, is happening at the same time that the French are developing a mass-based education, public education system in France itself in the late 19th century. And in that they did invest. And that's what made the difference. So you have those kinds of issues. And education is a very interesting idea for me in many ways, because it so often interacts with race and racial sort of organization. In the United States, of course, the big issue, the issue that launched the civil rights movement was the issue of school integration, the issue of education for Black children. And one of the things that is really tragic about this story is that the first, the Supreme Court decision for banning segregated education was passed in 1954, over 60 years ago. American public schools remain to this day very much segregated racially. Black children have fewer opportunities to succeed in education than white children do. Even the liberal sort of cities, like the city where I live, New York. New York is some of the most segregated public schools in the United States. And it has been run by Democrats and liberals for many, many years. So this is something that goes beyond partisan politics in the United States and really speaks to an inability to provide for true racial equality and therefore true freedom, because ultimately to be free is to be, as you say, in that sense, is to be civilized. If you believe that, then you have to provide people the ability to civilize themselves. If you don't, then you clearly don't believe in it.
Clear. I'd like to invite Dr. Guadeloupe to join us, and I will ask my final question, which I think relates to some of the challenging questions Dr. Guadeloupe asked. So in the final part of the book, you turn to the fundamental post-war challenge to white freedom in the chapter 6. And I'm referring, of course, to the wave of decolonization after the Second World War and the civil rights movement in the United States. And I think my question relates to some of the points Dr. Guadeloupe raised. Can you explain how you conceptualize their freedom struggles? So do you interpret them as struggles for Black freedom or colored freedom? Or do you interpret their struggles as going beyond racialized conceptions of freedom? And yeah, if you've answered the question, I'd like Francio Guadeloupe to join in also in the conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I'm happy to answer that. And then please, Dr. Guadeloupe, please join in as well. So I think what you've spoken to it was a real tension in many of these movements. And let me speak from the perspective of the American Civil Rights Movement. There were many different strands to that movement. I think the dominant strand really spoke to the idea that the only way you could get rid of anti-Black racism was to get rid of all racism. That there was such a great belief that Black people had for so long been at the bottom of the racial hierarchy in the United States. In some ways, it was sort of like Marx's idea of the proletariat. It was the class that, the only way it could succeed was to abolish the idea of class altogether. So I would argue for a variety of reasons, that was probably the dominant strain in the civil rights movement. And one should remember, of course, that there was a movement for Black civil rights, but there were lots of people that were not Black that were involved in it as well. But there were other strands as well. There was a whole Black nationalist strand that had both cultural and political dimensions that really argued for Black freedom in particular, and said that people that dreamed of the abolition of racism altogether were naive and fooling themselves. And you had to fight for the community empowerment in order to ensure this kind of liberation. So I think this is a question that existed on many different levels. I think it also existed among many movements for decolonization in Africa and Asia. And I think ultimately it really was, people tended to focus on community empowerment as opposed to a more sort of general vision of the abolition of racism as a whole. But I think that vision always retained a lot amount of power. So.
So Dr. Francio Guadeloupe, would you like to restate one or more of your questions? Because I'm not sure whether Professor Stovall has written down all your questions in the beginning.
I have actually written down several.
And I think Professor Stovall can speak to them. And of course, I'm an anthropologist, so I was not speaking about whether something happened in that age or didn't happen. They were primarily conceptual questions in relation to the book. So I think that the book is arguing for the universalist push that was part of the civil rights movement and not for the racial settlement idea that existed in these other movements. Is that correct?
Well, sure, but let me, in answering your questions, because I took notes, I thought one of the things that would be interesting to me to do, you talked about my own sort of personal engagement and my personal, and I thought it'd be interesting for you to talk a bit about that, about where I came from. I'm a historian, so I believe perhaps one of the things I can use to shed light on my work is my own history. and how it fits into this book and how it provides this book. So I was actually born the year of the Brown versus Board of Education civil rights decision. I was born right at the beginning of the civil rights movement. And one of the things I think about in looking at my own age is that, I'm now, at an advanced age, and these questions are still very much posed in the United States and in the world. I grew up in that movement, right? I grew up in going to demonstrations for civil rights. I grew up in going to demonstrations for integrated education. That was very much shaped, my own life. I also grew up with many different sort of successive terms for what it meant to be Black American, ranging from Negro to color to Black American, so on and so forth. So I think in looking at this history and looking at my own history, part of the key question is, so what does it take to make Black people free? What does it take to enable all people to be free? And I admit to be still being very much shaped by this universal vision. That is not to say that I have not been exposed to others, and that other visions do not have a lot of merit to themselves, because I can see that in many ways, this vision has been a failure in the United States. In some ways it has succeeded, but Blacks are still not equal. As I pointed out, American schools are still very much segregated. And this vision has not been in and of itself sufficient to guarantee the goals for which the movement started. So let me just say that you posed a number of questions, Dr. Guadalupe. I want
to ask. Sorry, Professor. Before you go on, I want to ask the audience or mention to the audience that they can from now on raise questions in the Q&A. I will collect them and then make a selection out of them if there are too many. And please go on.
Okay, so yeah, you posed a number of questions, but several of them centered around this whole idea of the relationship between whiteness and my rejection of whiteness on the one hand, and the idea of race in general, and how I stood on that idea. And it's an interesting question, because I think that to say that you reject whiteness, to say that you reject white privilege, is not necessarily to say that you reject the idea of race altogether, just simply because there are many ways in which different racial groupings have their own very rich cultures that make our world a much more interesting and exciting place to live in than if it was monochrome. When you think about the communities that are created around racial groups, they are very diverse communities. They are very diverse communities internally, but they also are united at times by a certain racial experience, which can be negative, but can also be positive. So to put it this way, I do not necessarily envisage a world without any kind of racial distinctions. I do not envisage a world, certainly, where everybody is white, or where that kind of definition has no relevance to people's lives, because I think A, it would be hard to imagine, and B, it would be impoverished in a lot of ways. I like the different cultures that have resulted from racial groupings, even if those groupings were involuntary. The history of African Americans is the history of a group that was put together involuntarily, that was composed of many different peoples from many different places, and that was forced into unity. But out of that has come a very interesting kind of culture that has had a lot of has offered a lot to peoples throughout the United States and throughout the world. And I think you could say that of many other cultures, that the racial unity that has resulted oftentimes from oppression and exclusion has nonetheless had its positive sides as well. So I value these cultures, and I enjoy exploring racial cultures that are different from mine, because they're very interesting, and I learn a lot from them. So I think that's one way of answering that question. And then this sort of leads up to the other major series of questions you asked, which is about religion and the ways in which religion represents another kind of universality and is tied into relational ideas. Let me just say that, for example, when I was a little kid, I was targeted as very intelligent, so therefore I was supposed to become a minister, because that was what happened to smart Black boys, right? I disappointed my family gravely. I did not show a vocation for the ministry. But people have said that, well, when you're teaching and you're sort of preaching at the same time, well, maybe you're not as far away from it as you think you might be. I'll leave that to you to decide. But yeah, the idea of a vocation that goes beyond, and I think especially if you look at the whole idea of slave religion, the idea of a vocation that goes beyond immediate day-to-day oppression and looks for something that unites oneself and one's community with a division of the divine and the division of the and a vision of the universe, is something that's very precious, and is something that is part of this whole history of resistance to racism. I think is very important. I mean, people often have pointed out that the leadership of the civil rights movement in the United States was almost entirely Christian ministers, right? That it came out of the church, and I think in many other communities as well. Religion has been a powerful source of community empowerment, and also a powerful source of a belief in the universality of humanity, faced against God, in contrast with God. So I think it's something that's very powerful, and I think that is something that is a part and parcel of this whole idea of racialized definitions of communities in the modern world. So.
Francio, would you like to respond? And I would also like to notify the audience that the Q&A is open.
I would not necessarily like to respond. Thank you for the answers. I'm curious, René, how you sit in this whole thing, because then we can have a three-way conversation.
Sure.
So the question I was still that was going through my mind was how you conceptualize freedom, because as you of course know, freedom can mean many different people, both and historically.
Yeah.
One can distinguish a more rights-based liberal conception of freedom. One can distinguish a more democratic conception of freedom as self-government, and yet others have defined freedom in more substantive terms, in terms of capabilities, in terms of a minimal threshold, minimal social goods that enable freedom. So I was just wondering, reading the book, is there a particular conception of freedom that plays a central role in your history of white freedom? Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me add one more point to that, which is there are also negative definitions of freedom, which I find very interesting. The idea of anarchism as a negative definition of freedom. The idea of libertinage. The libertine is somebody whose freedom is ultimately destructive and self-destructive. Okay. So part of the story is how freedom becomes a positive value, because it wasn't always, right? And there are indications even in the modern era. For the Nazis, for example, freedom was only real if it meant submission to the state authority, the authority of the race. Otherwise, it was not valuable at all. And so it's one of the reasons why the first chapter of my book deals with what I call savage freedom, and looks at two groups, which some people have said is strange that I put together, but I think there's a reason for that: pirates and children. Both are seen as people that are in many ways by nature free, but their kind of freedom is not the freedom that you build a modern society out of. So it has to be suppressed. Pirates have to be destroyed. Children have to grow up or be made to grow up. But the end point is the same. So there's this idea that freedom has to be controlled, in effect. It has to have a certain orientation towards certain goals. It cannot simply be doing whatever you want whenever you want. Okay. But of course, that's always the challenge with freedom, because even in suppressing the idea of piracy and childhood, both these ideas retain considerable attraction, right? Even modern society looks at piracy with a combination of dread, but also desire, right? There's a real desire about, wanting to have freedom. As I put it in the book at one point, I use the example of jury duty. Americans are subject to the idea of having to serve on juries. It's part and parcel of our existence as a free republic. But I asked the question, when do you feel more free? When you're called up for jury duty and therefore serve on a jury, or when you get out of jury duty and can go ahead and do what you want without having to worry about that? My guess is that most people, if they're honest, would answer the question by saying the latter. They feel more free when they don't have to serve as part of this whole political structure, right? So to answer, this is a long way around answering your question, Renee, but to answer it, let me just say that I think that ultimately freedom is something that should be something that enables people to maximize their potential, both as individuals, but also as part of a community. And freedom should be something that is mutually constitutive of a better life for all, that does not rely on oppressing somebody else. If it does, then it's not really true freedom, it's something else and much less desirable.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the audience. Jetske asks or says, first of all, and I quote, "Thank you for this interesting lecture. I strongly believe that racism was used as a justification for immoral, unethical behavior." So I take it instead of as a support for the conception of freedom. So the question is, could racism not be addressed in that light? So as a justification for immoral behavior?
I think, I think there's some truth to that. And certainly, if you looked at, racist acts of violence, racism was a justification for that. But I think that's not the whole story, because racism is also the motivating factor for many of those kinds of acts. I mean, for example, look at the American tradition of lynching. It wasn't necessarily that people lynched Black people that they didn't like and then justified it by racist means. On the other hand, they lynched them because they were Black. And that was the prima facie justification of these acts. So I think the two tend to go together. I mean, I think that one can certainly justify acts of inhumanity, at least implicitly, because they happen to people of a different skin color or a different race. But I think it's also true that oftentimes these acts are undertaken precisely because these people are seen as inferior, and therefore it's not immoral to treat them in a brutal kind of way.
May I have a short go at that? Mm-hmm. One of the ways of understanding universality or understanding racism is to call it our inherited universality. You think of racism as that, then it was an operation that constructed our ideas of continents consisting of people that we can group in racial categories. Blackness within anthropology, social sciences, and so forth, is a particular operation that was conducted upon people of African descent around the 1600s, late 1600s, 1700s. That's when it started. To be able to move large tracts of people to what was called the New World to work as laborers. Before you could do that, you had to make them Black. So which means when racism is meted out upon people that are Black, we cannot forget that there was first a first move, which is that inherited universality of designating them Black, because that was not a self-conception on the African continent. That was a conception that emerged through a set of racial logics. So I don't see how one gets away. I don't see how you can clean that up. If racism is our inherited universality, we need to move to another universality. And there is no way to me of clearing that up or keeping some of it. Now, I recognize that perhaps for contextual, pragmatic reasons, one might want to keep some of it. But if you seriously interrogate it, you can't keep any of it. So let me stop there.
Okay, let me respond to that by saying that, I mean, I think that there are different ways to conceive of the universal. And I think that one of the most interesting ways that you get out of the struggles of subaltern groups, racially subaltern groups, is how you combine a racial identity with a universal identity, universality defined in terms of humanity as a whole. One of my interests is the whole study of the literary movement called Negritude in France in the 1930s, for example. Aimé Césaire and people like that looked at Black culture, but also looked at it as a reflection of universal culture, and really tried to put the two together and sometimes more successfully than others. But that was their goal, to see being Black as not seeing being Black as implicitly attached to humanity in all its dimensions and not just one part of humanity. So I think that has been the goal. Sometimes it's been achieved, sometimes it has not been. But I think that's been the goal of movements like this. And I think it's a good goal.
So I have another question from the audience. Could Professor Stovall elaborate on the material dimensions of white freedom and what non-racial or non-racialized freedom would mean in terms of material or redistributive justice?
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, very interesting question. And it sort of picks up on where I as Dr. Guadeloupe noted, where I end the book at the very end, which is talking about one of the reasons for white freedom, for the idea of white privilege as freedom, is a belief that you have to have that in order to guarantee a certain standard of support, material existence for a white population, and that it is hard to see oneself it's hard to see one freeing oneself from that without a kind of system that really ensures an adequate series of material supports for all peoples, regardless of race. So it seems to me that's one of the major goals of looking at this system. But no, I do think that, it works itself out in many different kinds of ways. Classically, of course, the ultimate example of the materiality of white freedom was the ability to own slaves. As historians in America and other countries have noted, so much of modern American economy was based on slave labor, was the accumulation of wealth was based on slavery, that if you were going to be successful materially, you had to own slaves. It's one of the reasons why time and time again, at least in American history, some of the people that talked most about the importance of freedom were the people that owned slaves, right? Because it was their ability to own slaves that guaranteed their material freedom. So, so I think it starts with that, but I think and that has sort of legacy that comes down to the present day of ultimately, since so much of wealth which enabled freedom was based in racial oppression, there are ways in which that's still true to the present day, I would say.
I have a great follow-up question from the audience on the present also, from Ruth and Aika. So their question is, do you think the Biden government will start to represent a break with the long tradition of institutional racism in the United States?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's a question that in some ways was personal for me, because I was a college student in Boston during the era of busing for school integration, the movement to integrate American schools via busing. In fact, I actually had acid thrown in my face at one point as a result of that whole very conflicted time. One of the biggest opponents of school busing for integration was Joe Biden, who was just getting started in the Senate. So even though he was running against a man that many of us regarded as the devil incarnate last year, I still had to think long and hard about voting for him, because this is something he has never renounced, his rejection of school integration via busing. So I am not at all sure that he will. I think, on the other hand, at the same time, he's a very different man from what he was 40 years ago. America's a very different place. It is possible, but I think it's only possible if Black people and people of color and others really hold his feet to the fire and really insist on this. The era of George Floyd has, really made this seem much more possible. If it does happen, I would think it'll be less due to Joe Biden in particular, and more due to the popular movement that's forcing him into taking these kinds of questions into account.
So we're drawing to an end, also because Professor Stovall told us that he has to go to another meeting. It's 2:00 where you are, I believe, as you are in your capacity as a dean of the graduate school. There were more great questions in the Q&A, but I'm afraid we have to call it a day here. at least for us here in the Netherlands. So I want to thank Dr. Francio Guadeloupe very much for his opening statement and his great questions. I want to thank, of course, Spui 25, in particular Jetske Brouwer, Fatima Kamal, Maxime de Straatman, and Merlijn Olman of the Dutch Review of Books for bringing this event together. And finally, I want to, of course, thank Professor Tyler Stovall for his wonderful book and also wonderful answers and explorations of the Book of White Freedom. So there is a 10% discount for those who want to buy the book by Professor Stovall. The code is in the chat or in the Q&A, Stovall 2021 if you buy it with Princeton University Press. Otherwise, of course, buy your book with your local bookstore and not with Amazon or Bol.com, because there's a special place in hell for those people who buy them with the giants. So thank you very much, everyone, and have